Story 1. The Discarded Backpack. I wasn't the kind of guy who paid much attention to small details. Back in 2016, I was living alone in this tiny studio apartment in a quiet part of the city. I worked a 9-to-5 job at an accounting firm, and my life was painfully routine. Wake up at 6:30 a.m., coffee at the same corner cafe, work, and then home by 6 p.m. I didn't have many friends in the area and spent most of my evenings scrolling through Netflix or gaming. Looking back now, I think my predictable habits might have been my first mistake. It was a rainy Thursday when it happened. I remember because I was fumbling with my umbrella as I walked into the narrow alley behind my building. That alley was where the garbage bins were, and I usually cut through it to get to my apartment quicker. That day though, something caught my eye. A black backpack lying slumped against the wall, half soaked from the rain. At first I figured someone had just forgotten it there, but it seemed so out of place. The alley wasn't a spot where people hung around, and it looked like it had been deliberately propped up, almost like someone wanted me to notice it. I don't know what came over me, but I felt compelled to check it out. Maybe it was boredom or maybe just curiosity, I can't say for sure. I looked around to see if anyone else was nearby, but the alley was empty except for the faint sound of rain hitting the pavement. The backpack looked ordinary enough. A plain, worn-out black canvas bag with a couple of frayed straps. I crouched down, hesitated for a moment, then unzipped the main compartment. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Not disgusting, but a faint musty odor, like something that had been sitting forgotten in a basement. Inside, there were no clothes or obvious belongings, just a jumble of loose papers, a small spiral notebook, and a cheap pen. I took out the papers and held them under the dim light of the building's exterior lamp. That's when the weirdness started. The first page I picked up was handwritten in a jagged scrawl, like whoever wrote it was in a rush or not used to holding a pen. The words didn't make sense at first. 6:45 a.m. Alarm. 7:15 a.m. Coffee at corner cafe, large black. 8 a.m. Walk to bus stop, 8:12 a.m. departure. My stomach dropped. Those weren't random notes, they were my routine. Word for word, minute for minute, it matched my daily schedule exactly. I flipped to another page. Monday, blue shirt, black slacks, brown loafers. Tuesday, gray button-up, navy pants, black shoes. I swallowed hard. That was exactly what I had worn earlier that week. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine as I sifted through the rest of the papers. Each one was a snapshot of my life, but from someone else's perspective. Notes about my habits, like how I always tapped my coffee cup twice before taking a sip, or how I paused for a moment before crossing the street at the corner of 8th and Pine. Things I didn't even realize were noticeable. The spiral notebook was even worse. Flipping through it, I found crude sketches of my apartment building, my bus stop, even the exact layout of the cafe I went to every morning. There were arrows and annotations, little scribbles like "sits by the window" or "leaves napkin folded in half." The level of detail was unnerving. I quickly stuffed everything back into the bag, zipped it up, and stood there in the rain, heart pounding. My first instinct was to take it inside, but as I reached my apartment door, a wave of panic hit me. What if someone was watching me right now? I glanced up and down the street, but there was no one, just the faint glow of streetlights and the rain pooling in the gutters. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was intentional, that whoever left this backpack wanted me to find it. Instead of going inside, I left the bag just outside my door and hurried up to my apartment, locking the deadbolt behind me. Once I was inside, I couldn't calm down. My apartment, usually my sanctuary, felt like it was closing in on me. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone standing there, peering in. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe this was some kind of prank? But who would go to such lengths to document my life in such obsessive detail? And why? My phone sat on the counter, and I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? "Hi, I found a backpack with notes about me?" It sounded ridiculous, and I wasn't sure they'd take it seriously. Instead, I sat on the couch, staring at the door, wondering if I'd made a mistake leaving the bag out there. Minutes dragged by and then I heard it, a faint, deliberate knock on my door. My blood ran cold. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just sat frozen, staring at the door. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I forced myself to stand, my legs feeling like lead. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing. The hallway was empty. I waited, heart pounding in my chest, and slowly backed away. Then my phone buzzed. I grabbed it instinctively, relieved for the distraction, but the notification made my stomach drop. It was a text from an unknown number. "You left it outside. Aren't you curious what else is inside?" My hands were trembling as I stared at the screen. The message felt like a punch to the gut. Someone knew I had found the bag, and worse, they knew I had left it outside my door. My first thought was to call someone, anyone, but who? I didn't have close friends nearby, and calling the police still felt premature, even though every instinct was screaming at me that something was wrong. I paced the room trying to think. Should I bring the bag inside? Should I throw it away? My mind kept going back to the text. How did they know I'd looked inside? And what did they mean by "what else is inside"? Against my better judgment, I opened the door. The hallway was empty, just as it had been when I looked through the peephole, but the bag was no longer there. A wave of nausea hit me. Someone had taken it, but who? And when? My mind raced with possibilities. Had they been waiting, watching, just out of sight? I shut the door quickly and locked it again, leaning against it as I tried to steady my breathing. The apartment felt suffocating now, like every shadow was hiding someone. I didn't know what to do, so I did the only thing I could think of. I turned off all the lights, sat on the floor, and waited in the dark, hoping that whoever was out there would just leave me alone. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing again. The room was pitch black, and for a moment I forgot where I was. The screen illuminated my face as I checked the new message. "Check your mailbox." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Part of me didn't want to move, but another part needed answers. This was some twisted game. I wanted it to end. Summoning every ounce of courage, I decided to confront whatever this was. I grabbed a kitchen knife, not my proudest moment, but it made me feel slightly safer, and headed toward the mailbox station in the lobby. The lobby was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly. My mailbox was number 23. With shaky hands, I opened it and found a single envelope with no markings. Inside was a photograph that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of me sitting on my couch in my apartment from just a few hours ago. On the back were the words, "Found you." That was it. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I left everything behind that night, packed a bag, got into my car, and drove until the city was a distant memory. It's been years and I've changed my name, my appearance, everything. But every so often, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. Maybe I am. Maybe you are too. Story 2. The Babysitter's Visitor. I was 17 when it happened, just a regular Friday night during my junior year of high school. Back then, I used to babysit for extra cash, and the Matthews family was one of my regular gigs. They lived in this old house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by huge oak trees that made the place feel kind of isolated. It wasn't creepy or anything, just peaceful in that suburban way where every house looks similar, and you can hear the faint hum of crickets in the background. That night, I was watching the kids, Sophie and Ben, who were 6 and 3. Their parents were out at some late dinner party, and they told me they wouldn't be back until after midnight. I remember feeling grateful for the Wi-Fi because I had an English paper to finish and planned to work on it once the kids were asleep. Everything started out totally normal. Sophie wanted to watch some animated movie for the millionth time, and Ben kept asking for snacks every 10 minutes like toddlers do. By 9 p.m., both were asleep, and the house fell into that almost eerie quiet. I remember sitting at the dining room table with my laptop open, glancing at the clock every so often, just counting the hours until the parents would be home. It was around 10:15 when I heard the first knock at the door. It wasn't loud, but it was firm, deliberate. The kind of knock that says, "I know someone's in there." I froze for a second, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Who'd be knocking this late in a neighborhood like this? My stomach tightened a little, but I figured it was probably a delivery mistake or a neighbor. Still, I decided to be cautious. I walked quietly to the door, careful not to make a sound. The peephole was a bit warped, but I could make out a man standing there, maybe in his late 40s, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He wasn't anyone I recognized from the neighborhood, and that made me uneasy. "Who is it?" I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It's Mike," the man replied, his voice muffled but calm. "I'm Sophie and Ben's uncle. I was in the area and thought I'd stop by." My mind immediately threw up a red flag. The Matthews had never mentioned an uncle, and they were the type of people who'd leave detailed notes about literally everything. Emergency numbers, bedtimes, favorite snacks. There were an uncle I'd know. "Sorry, I wasn't told anyone would be coming over," I said, my voice as neutral as possible. I heard him sigh, almost impatiently. "Look, I understand. But I really am their uncle. Just let me in for a second to grab something I left here last time." That didn't sit right with me either. The Matthews hadn't mentioned anyone staying at their house recently. My palms were starting to sweat, and my heart was pounding so hard I was sure he'd hear it. "I can't do that," I finally managed to say, my hand gripping the edge of the door frame like it was my anchor. "If you need something, you can call their parents." There was a long silence, and I thought, maybe hoped, he'd given up. But then I heard him say, almost under his breath, "I really don't think you want to make this harder than it has to be." My stomach dropped at his words. There was something in his tone, low and almost conversational, but laced with a subtle menace, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stayed frozen by the door, trying to figure out my next move. Should I call the police? Text the parents? My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to think. "I can't help you," I said as firmly as I could manage, though my voice cracked a little at the end. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of crickets outside. Then the man spoke again, his voice sharper now, almost annoyed. "Look, just open the door, kid. I don't have all night." That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. No relative, no matter how impatient, would talk like that to a babysitter. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting toward the kitchen where I'd left my phone. Before I could move, I heard the handle jiggle. He was testing the lock. My blood ran cold, and I immediately ran to grab my phone, clutching it like a lifeline. My fingers fumbled over the screen as I tried to dial the Matthews number, but my mind was racing so fast that I kept messing up. I finally managed to call, but it went straight to voicemail. Of course. They were probably at some loud restaurant, oblivious to what was happening. I started typing out a text instead, telling them someone was trying to get in and asking if they knew a Mike. But before I could hit send, I heard a loud bang at the door like he'd kicked it. I froze again, panic gripping me so tightly that I could barely breathe. The kids. My eyes shot toward the hallway where they were sleeping, and my heart raced even faster. If he got in, they were defenseless. I forced myself to move, gripping my phone and creeping toward the hallway as quietly as I could. My only thought was to protect Sophie and Ben no matter what. As I passed the living room, I saw the curtains were slightly open and my stomach flipped. What if he was watching me from one of the windows? I crouched low, trying to stay out of sight, and made my way to the kids' rooms. Sophie's door was slightly ajar, and I peeked in to see her curled up under her blanket, sound asleep. Ben's room was the same, quiet, peaceful, completely unaware of the danger. I closed both doors gently, trying to make as little noise as possible. My breathing was shallow, and I could feel the pulse in my ears as I texted the parents again, this time with just one word: help. I crept back to the living room and decided to call 911. My hands were trembling so badly it took me 3 tries to dial the number. When the operator answered, I tried to keep my voice low but urgent. "Someone's trying to break into the house I'm babysitting at," I whispered. She asked for the address, and I gave it to her, feeling a small surge of relief when she said officers were on their way. But then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A scraping sound coming from the side of the house. It was slow, deliberate, like someone dragging something along the siding. I felt paralyzed, my mind racing with all the possibilities. Was he trying to find another way in? Was he already inside? Every instinct in my body screamed at me to check, but fear kept me rooted in place. The scraping sound moved closer, now accompanied by faint, muffled footsteps. He wasn't just lurking outside anymore, he was circling the house. My eyes darted to the back door, and I suddenly remembered something the Matthews had told me the first time I babysat. The sliding glass door in the kitchen didn't lock properly. My heart sank. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy ceramic lamp from the side table, and slowly made my way toward the kitchen. The house felt too quiet, the kind of silence that makes every little noise stand out like a gunshot. As I approached the kitchen, I could see the sliding door through the dim light spilling in from the porch. My worst fear was confirmed. The curtain covering the door wasn't drawn all the way, and there, just outside the glass, was the silhouette of a man. He stood still as if he were waiting for something, and then he raised his hand to test the handle. I clutched the lamp tighter, my palms slick with sweat, and crouched behind the kitchen counter. I could hear the faint rattle of the door as he tugged on it, his patience clearly wearing thin. My mind was screaming at me to run, to grab the kids and barricade us in a room until the cops arrived. But before I could move, he spoke again, his voice eerily calm, like he was trying to reason with me. "I know you're in there. I saw the lights. Just let me in and I'll be gone in a minute." His tone sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't a plea, it was a command. I stayed silent, barely breathing, praying he'd give up and leave. But deep down, I knew this man wasn't going to walk away that easily. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and frantic, as the man tugged on the handle again, harder this time. The sliding door rattled, and I could see the faint outline of his breath fogging up the glass. I kept thinking, where are the police? It felt like hours had passed since I called, but in reality, it had probably been only a few minutes. I tightened my grip on the lamp and peeked over the edge of the counter, just enough to see his shadow move to the side. My mind raced. Was he giving up? Was he trying to find another way in? My stomach churned at the thought of him slipping through an open window or finding some other weak spot in the house. Then I heard a faint tap against the glass, a single deliberate knock. It was like he was toying with me, waiting for me to crack. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice low but audible through the thin glass. "I just want to talk." I couldn't hold back anymore. I bolted out of the kitchen and back toward the hallway where the kids were sleeping. My only thought was to get them somewhere safe, somewhere he couldn't reach us. I opened Sophie's door first, shaking her awake as gently as I could. Her sleepy, confused eyes blinked up at me, but I put a finger to my lips. "Shh, sweetie, we have to play a quiet game, okay? Grab your bunny and follow me." She nodded, clutching her stuffed animal, and I moved quickly to Ben's room. Getting them both up and out of bed without making noise felt impossible, but somehow we managed. The three of us huddled in the master bedroom closet, my heart pounding as I locked the door behind us. The closet was cramped, filled with coats and the faint smell of cedar from mothballs, but it was the safest place I could think of. Sophie sat curled up against me, clutching her bunny tightly, while Ben, too young to fully understand what was happening, started to whimper. I pressed my hand gently over his mouth, whispering, "It's okay, buddy. We're just playing hide and seek." My voice was trembling, and I prayed they couldn't hear the fear in it. Outside the closet, the house had gone quiet again. I strained to hear anything. Footsteps, the sliding door opening, even the sound of police sirens, but there was nothing. Just that suffocating silence. Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible, "Who's out there?" I shook my head, pulling her closer. "Just stay quiet, sweetie," I murmured. "Everything's going to be fine." Minutes dragged by like hours, and my nerves were on edge with every second. Then I heard it, a faint creak from the hallway floorboards. My stomach dropped. Someone was inside the house. I instinctively pulled the kids closer, holding my breath as the sound grew louder. The floorboards groaned with each step, deliberate and heavy, as if whoever it was wanted me to know they were coming. I could feel Sophie trembling against me, her tiny hand gripping my arm like a vice. Ben had gone completely silent, his wide eyes staring up at me in the dim light. The footsteps stopped just outside the master bedroom door. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. The doorknob rattled softly, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of it turning. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed as the doorknob turned slowly. The door didn't open, thank God I'd locked it, but the rattling continued, more insistent now. My mind raced with every worst-case scenario. Did he have something to break the door down? Was he armed? I clutched the kids tighter, whispering reassurances I wasn't even sure I believed. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the rattling stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I strained to hear, but all I caught was the faintest shuffle, like he was moving away from the door. I wanted to believe he was leaving, but my gut told me otherwise. This man wasn't giving up. My thoughts were interrupted by a sound that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. A window sliding open somewhere in the house. The realization hit me like a punch. The lock on the downstairs bathroom window was broken. I'd noticed it during one of my earlier babysitting shifts but hadn't thought much of it at the time. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone, but I managed to text 911 again. He's inside. Send someone now. I hugged Sophie and Ben as tightly as I could, trying to block out the images flashing through my head. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. And then, finally, I heard it, the sound of distant sirens. Relief and fear collided in my chest. Would they get here in time? Would he hear them and run, or would he panic and do something worse? The sirens grew louder, closer, until the red and blue lights illuminated the edges of the blinds. I whispered to the kids, "Stay here," and slowly crept out of the closet, my legs trembling like jelly. As I stepped out of the closet, my entire body felt like it was moving in slow motion. The house was eerily quiet again, except for the faint hum of the sirens growing louder outside. I crept toward the bedroom door, every creak of the floorboards beneath me feeling like it might give me away. My grip tightened around the ceramic lamp, my only weapon. I opened the door just a crack and peered into the hallway. It was empty, but the air felt heavy, charged with a kind of tension that made my skin crawl. I moved cautiously toward the staircase, my breath shallow and quiet. That's when I saw it, a shadow, faint but unmistakable, moving across the wall downstairs. He was still inside. The headlights from the police cars briefly lit up the living room as they pulled into the driveway, and I heard the faint sound of car doors slamming. Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. The shadow moved quickly toward the kitchen, and I realized he must have seen the lights too. My heart raced as I imagined him bolting through the broken window before the cops could catch him. I leaned over the railing just enough to see him, a tall, broad-shouldered figure crouching near the back door. He turned his head slightly, and for the first time, I caught a glimpse of his face in the dim light. There was something unsettlingly blank about it, like he wasn't afraid or angry, just focused. Then, in one swift motion, he slipped out through the sliding door and into the night. The moment he disappeared into the dark, I bolted down the stairs, throwing open the front door and waving frantically at the officers. "He's in the backyard," I shouted, my voice trembling. Two of them immediately took off in that direction, flashlights cutting through the shadows as they ran. The third officer stayed with me, guiding me back into the house and asking if anyone else was inside. "The kids," I stammered. "They're in the closet upstairs." My voice cracked as the adrenaline started to wear off. He nodded, reassuring me they'd check every corner of the house. I followed him up the stairs, feeling a wave of relief when I opened the closet door to see Sophie and Ben still huddled together, their faces pale but safe. Sophie flung her arms around me and I held her tightly, whispering, "It's okay now. The police are here." Downstairs, I heard the crackle of the officers' radios and the sound of heavy boots moving through the yard. They didn't find him, of course. The backyard led to a small patch of woods, and by the time they searched the area, he was long gone. One of the officers stayed behind to file a report, asking me every question imaginable. Did I know the man? Had I seen him before? Could I describe him? I gave them everything I could remember. His voice, his clothes, that blank expression. But it didn't feel like enough. When the Matthews finally came home, they were horrified, apologizing over and over for what had happened. They had no idea who the man was, and when they checked with their relatives, none of them had been anywhere near the area that night. The broken window and footprints in the mud outside were the only signs he'd ever been there. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. The police promised to keep me updated, but they never found the man. No arrests, no leads, just the lingering fear that he might try again someday, maybe at another house with someone else less lucky. The Matthews replaced the broken window and upgraded their security system, even installing cameras around the property. They asked if I'd ever babysit for them again, but I couldn't bring myself to say yes. Every time I thought about that night, about his voice on the other side of the door or the way he moved so deliberately through the house, it sent a chill down my spine. Even now, years later, I still check the locks twice before going to bed. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night convinced I've heard that same knock at my door. What stayed with me most, though, are the small details, the ones that didn't make sense then and still don't now. Like the muddy footprints leading up to the porch that the police said had been there for hours before I arrived. Or the way Sophie later told me she'd seen a man standing at the edge of the backyard earlier that afternoon, watching her play. I think about how calm he sounded, how confident, like he'd done this before and knew exactly what he was doing. The scariest part isn't even that he got into the house, it's that he planned it. He waited. And for some reason, out of all the houses on that quiet street, he picked this one. I'll never know why, and maybe that's what keeps me up at night. Sometimes, the things we don't understand are more terrifying than the things we do. Story 3. The Uninvited Neighbor. When my wife and I moved into that little apartment on Oak Ridge Street, we were just looking for a fresh start. The place wasn't anything fancy, just a small 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of an old building that still smelled faintly of varnish from decades of refinishing. We were newly married, strapped for cash, and honestly just excited to have a place to call our own. Our neighbors seemed friendly enough, waving in the hallways or offering polite nods on the stairs. But one of them stood out immediately, Greg. He was tall, with a wiry build, thinning blonde hair combed straight back, and eyes that seemed to dart around as if they were always searching for something. He introduced himself the day we moved in, appearing suddenly at our door with a tray of cookies that were a little too perfect, like something you'd see in a magazine. At first we thought Greg was just being nice. He told us he'd lived in the building for years and offered to help with anything we needed, fixing a leaky faucet, figuring out the heating system, even watching over the place if we ever went out of town. It felt comforting to have someone so eager to help, especially since we didn't know anyone in the area. But Greg quickly became a little too familiar. He started stopping by unannounced, usually with some flimsy excuse about hearing strange noises or wanting to check if we were settling in okay. At first, we'd laugh it off, chalking it up to an overbearing but harmless neighbor. But then we started noticing little things. Like how Greg always seemed to know what we'd been up to, even when we hadn't told him. And how sometimes when we came home, things in our apartment felt just slightly off. One Saturday morning, I woke up earlier than usual to make coffee and found Greg standing in our living room. My heart nearly stopped. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there with his hands in his pockets, staring at the bookshelf my wife had painstakingly arranged. When I finally gathered the nerve to ask him what the hell he was doing, he looked at me with this bizarre mix of confusion and offense. "I heard a noise," he said, his voice calm, almost casual. "Thought maybe you needed help." I didn't know how to respond. The door had been locked, I was sure of it, and I hadn't heard a single sound. My wife came out of the bedroom then, and Greg just smiled at her, waved awkwardly, and walked out like nothing had happened. After that, things started escalating. I made a point to check the locks every night before bed, even going so far as to wedge a chair under the doorknob. Yet somehow, Greg kept finding ways in. Sometimes we'd catch him standing in the kitchen, other times crouched near the front window like he was inspecting the frame. Every time his excuse was the same: he'd heard something and wanted to make sure we were okay. He'd always leave without protest, but that strange, searching look in his eyes lingered long after he was gone. It wasn't just his presence that unnerved me, it was the way he moved, how quiet he was. No matter how alert we tried to stay, Greg always seemed to appear without a sound, like he'd been there all along, just waiting. One night, after Greg's third uninvited visit in a single week, my wife and I decided to confront him directly. We waited until the next morning and knocked on his door. It took him a while to answer, and when he did, it was as if he'd been expecting us. His apartment was eerily sparse. No furniture aside from a single chair, no decorations, not even a TV. The air inside felt stale, like the windows hadn't been opened in years. "I just wanted to help," he said, smiling that same unsettling smile. "You're new here. This building, it's got its quirks. I know how to handle them." His words sent a chill down my spine. There was something off about the way he said quirks, like he wasn't talking about creaky floors or bad plumbing. After that conversation, we avoided Greg as much as possible. But he didn't make it easy. He'd knock on the door at odd hours, sometimes late at night, insisting he needed to check something. We stopped answering, hoping he'd take the hint, but that only seemed to frustrate him. One evening, as I was coming back from work, I found him standing in the hallway outside our apartment. He didn't say a word, just stood there with his head tilted slightly, staring at the door. When I asked what he was doing, he muttered something under his breath and walked away, disappearing down the dimly lit staircase. I started to feel like we were being watched constantly, even inside our own home. My wife felt it too, and we both began to dread the silence, as if it was only a matter of time before Greg found another excuse to let himself in. The breaking point came one rainy Thursday night. My wife and I were watching a movie when we heard the faint sound of something scraping against the window in the living room. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch swaying in the wind, but then it happened again, long, deliberate, and unmistakably intentional. I crept to the window, my heart pounding, and pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. Greg was there, standing in the downpour on the fire escape, staring directly at me through the glass. His face was calm, eerily calm, despite the rain soaking his clothes and plastering his hair to his forehead. When he saw me, he didn't flinch or apologize. He just raised his hand slowly and pointed to the lock on the window as if to say it wasn't secure. I slammed the curtain shut and immediately called the building manager. I'd had enough. The manager, a gruff older man named Frank, listened patiently as I described everything that had happened. "Greg?" he said, his tone incredulous. "Are you sure?" When I confirmed, he let out a heavy sigh and told me he'd handle it. But before hanging up, he added something that made my stomach drop. "That guy hasn't rented an apartment here in years. Not since the fire." I tried pressing him for more details, but he muttered something about needing to check old records and quickly ended the call. My wife and I sat there in stunned silence, the rain pounding against the windows as the realization hit us. Greg wasn't supposed to be here. After Frank's revelation, my wife and I couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the old building felt amplified, each one sending a fresh wave of paranoia through us. Around 3 a.m., we decided we couldn't stay there another night. We started packing essentials, clothes, our laptops, anything we could grab quickly. But as I was stuffing a bag, I heard the distinct sound of the doorknob rattling. My blood ran cold. My wife froze mid-step, her eyes wide with terror. Slowly, I crept to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. A faint whisper came from the other side, low and almost sing-song. It was Greg. "It's not safe for you here," he murmured. I can keep you safe. I didn't respond, too terrified to make a sound. My wife grabbed her phone to call the police, but just as she hit the dial button, the rattling stopped. A deafening silence filled the apartment, and for a moment I thought he'd gone. Then the sound of footsteps echoed from above, heavy and deliberate. We lived on the top floor. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. How was he above us? The footsteps grew louder, pacing back and forth, as if Greg was circling directly over our heads. I knew we couldn't wait for the police to arrive. We had to get out. Grabbing my wife's hand, I led her to the fire escape, praying we wouldn't run into him on the way down. The fire escape was slick from the rain, every step a precarious gamble as we hurried down, our breaths coming in sharp, shallow bursts. The city lights below flickered through the haze of the storm, but they felt impossibly far away. Halfway down, I made the mistake of glancing back up, and there he was. Greg. His figure loomed at the top of the fire escape, illuminated briefly by a flash of lightning. He wasn't chasing us, just standing there watching like some predator letting its prey tire itself out. His face, usually so composed, was twisted into something I can only describe as hunger. My wife tugged my arm, snapping me out of it, and we kept going, my hands trembling as I gripped the rusted rails. We finally reached the alley below and sprinted for the street, drenched and disoriented but alive. We flagged down a passing patrol car, the blue and red lights cutting through the rain like a lifeline. The officers listened as we poured out our story, their skepticism evident but muted by our obvious panic. One of them radioed for backup while the other insisted on escorting us back to the building. I didn't want to go, but the officer was firm, saying they needed to check the apartment for signs of trespassing. Reluctantly, we followed, every fiber of my being screaming that it was a mistake. When we reached our unit, the door was ajar, the lock splintered. Inside, everything was untouched, except for the window in the living room, which was now wide open. The officers swept through the apartment, guns drawn, calling out Greg's name as if expecting him to answer. But the place was empty, eerily so. One of them knelt to inspect the window, muttering something about it being forced open from the outside. My wife and I stood near the door, clutching each other, unable to take a step further inside. Then one of the officers called us over. "You said his name was Greg, right?" he asked, holding up a small Polaroid photo he'd found tucked behind the bookshelf. My stomach dropped as I looked at it. It was an old photo, faded and yellowed with age. In it, Greg stood with a group of people I didn't recognize, all posed in front of what looked like our building, though the facade was noticeably newer. Scrawled across the bottom in looping handwriting were the words, "Oak Ridge Fire Brigade, 1993. I asked the officer where he'd found the photo, but he just shook his head. "It doesn't make sense," he said. "This place didn't have a fire escape back then. It was added after the fire." That was when Frank, the building manager, showed up, looking pale and uneasy. He confirmed the officer's story. There had been a fire nearly 30 years ago, one that had gutted the top floor and killed several residents. Greg, it seemed, had been a firefighter who'd lived in the building, one of the first on the scene when the blaze broke out. He didn't make it out alive. Frank's voice trembled as he told us this, his eyes darting nervously to the open window. "I don't know what you saw," he said, "but it's not the first time someone's complained about him." Hearing Frank say that left me cold, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. My wife, who'd been quiet through most of this, finally spoke up, her voice shaking. "If he's dead, how does he keep getting in? How do we stop him?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly out of their depth. Frank just sighed and ran a hand over his face. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think he believes he's still protecting this place. He was obsessed with keeping everyone safe even back then. Maybe he doesn't know he's gone." That explanation did little to comfort us, especially when we noticed Greg's watch lying neatly on the windowsill. It was old, scuffed, and had stopped at exactly 3:17 a.m., the same time we'd heard him at the door earlier that night. The officers decided to stay in the building for the rest of the night, patrolling the hallways and checking the locks. Frank promised to get someone to change ours first thing in the morning, but sleep was out of the question. My wife and I sat on the couch, clutching each other, flinching at every sound the storm made outside. At one point, I swore I saw movement in the corner of the room, just a flicker in the shadows, but when I turned to look, it was gone. The hours dragged on until the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains. By then, we'd made up our minds, we couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever Greg was or wasn't, we didn't want to find out. The next morning, we packed up everything we could fit into our car and handed the keys back to Frank. He didn't argue, just nodded solemnly as if he'd seen this happen before. As we loaded the last of our bags, I noticed Greg standing on the sidewalk across the street watching us. He looked the same as always, calm, composed, with that faint, unsettling smile. But this time there was something different in his eyes. They weren't menacing or cold, they were almost sad. Like he knew we were leaving for good and he couldn't stop us. I felt an odd pang of guilt but quickly pushed it aside, starting the car and driving off without looking back. My wife and I didn't speak much on the way to her sister's house, too shaken to process everything. It's been a few months now and we haven't heard or seen anything since. Sometimes I find myself wondering about Greg, about who, or what, he really was. Was he just a restless spirit, tied to that building by some unfinished business? Or was he something darker, something we were lucky to escape from? I'll probably never know. What I do know is that we'll never rent an old apartment again, no matter how good the deal seems. And every now and then, when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I swear I hear that faint, deliberate tapping like someone testing a window lock. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but part of me knows better. Greg's still out there, watching, waiting, making sure everything is safe. Story 4. The delivery that never came. I've always been a night owl, so when I got the notification about a late-night delivery, it didn't seem like a big deal. It was a Thursday around 11 p.m., and I was in my small apartment, halfway through binging a true crime series. My life wasn't particularly exciting at the time, just me, my job as a freelance graphic designer, and my overly inquisitive cat, Pepper. I had ordered a replacement part for my desk chair a few days before, so I figured it was that. The notification said the delivery would arrive between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, which struck me as odd, but I brushed it off. Maybe the company was rolling out 24-hour shipping or something. Anyway, I went back to my show, waiting for the doorbell to ring. At 11:45, the intercom buzzed. I grabbed my phone and checked the camera feed. There was a man standing there, holding what looked like a small box. He wore one of those generic delivery uniforms, navy blue jacket, matching cap, but something about him didn't sit right. He was tall, with gaunt features and eyes that seemed just a little too wide, like he hadn't slept in days. Still, I buzzed him in. As he made his way up the stairs, I couldn't shake this weird feeling. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the kind of unease you get when you can't quite put your finger on what's wrong. Pepper, who usually greeted visitors by the door, had retreated under the couch. That should have been my first clue. When I opened the door, the man was already standing there, too close for comfort. He handed me the box, but his eyes weren't on me. They were darting around, scanning the hallway behind me and the inside of my apartment. Busy night? I asked, trying to keep things casual, but he didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head like he was listening for something. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he stepped forward, his boot crossing the threshold. "Nice place," he muttered, his voice low and raspy. I froze. There was no reason for him to comment on my apartment. My hand tightened on the door, and I forced a polite smile. "Thanks," I said, pushing the door a little closer to shutting. He didn't move back. After a tense second, he stepped back on his own, but not before glancing at the coat rack, the kitchen, and the hallway leading to my bedroom. "Well, have a good night," he said, flashing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Something about that smile made my stomach turn. I shut the door, bolted it, and stood there for a moment, listening. I could hear his footsteps retreating down the stairs, but they stopped before he reached the ground floor. My heart was pounding now. I didn't want to open the door again, but curiosity got the better of me. I tiptoed to the peephole and looked out. The hallway was empty. I tried to shake off the unease, but something about the encounter lingered. I opened the box, hoping to distract myself, but it was empty. Completely empty. My stomach dropped. Why would someone deliver an empty box at this hour? I stared at it, turning it over in my hands, looking for any kind of explanation. Maybe it was a mistake or some weird prank. But the weight of the man's gaze, the way he'd looked around my apartment like he was cataloging everything, made it hard to brush off as a coincidence. I tossed the box aside, locked every window, and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. But then around 12:30 a.m. I heard it. A faint sound like someone trying to open the front door to the building. My apartment is on the second floor, so I usually don't hear much from the street, but this was clear. I muted the TV and listened, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound shifted. Now it was footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving up the stairs. I told myself it could be a neighbor coming home late, but deep down I knew better. The timing was too perfect. The steps stopped just outside my door, and I could see a faint shadow under the gap. My chest tightened as the doorknob rattled lightly like someone was testing it. I didn't move. My mind raced through every possibility, but none of them made sense. Who tries to get into someone's apartment after delivering an empty box? My phone was on the coffee table, and I cursed myself for not grabbing it before I froze in place. The rattling stopped, but the shadow under the door didn't move. I stood there, holding my breath, straining to hear anything, breathing, shuffling, anything that might tell me what was going on. Then out of nowhere came 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not the casual kind you'd expect from a neighbor or even a second attempt at a delivery. These knocks had weight to them, like they were meant to make me feel cornered. My heart was hammering so loudly I thought he might hear it. For a moment I considered calling out, pretending I wasn't alone, but something told me to stay silent. The shadow shifted slightly, like whoever it was had bent down. A faint scratching sound followed, as if he was dragging something metal along the door. I backed away, finally grabbing my phone, and opened the camera app to check the live feed from the hallway. The screen flickered on, and there he was, standing with his face inches from my peephole, staring directly into it. His eyes looked empty, hollow, and his lips curled into that same unsettling smile. I felt a wave of nausea as his hand reached up and knocked again, 3 times, slower this time. I didn't know what to do. Calling the police crossed my mind, but what would I even say? There's a creepy delivery guy at my door didn't exactly sound urgent, and I wasn't sure if he'd even stick around long enough for them to get here. Instead, I hit record on the live feed, hoping to capture something, anything, that could justify my fear if I needed to explain it later. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity, just staring into the peephole like he could see me through it. Then, without warning, he straightened up and turned toward the hallway camera. I swear he looked directly at me through the screen, his eyes narrowing slightly before he started walking away, slow and deliberate. I stayed glued to the camera feed, watching as he disappeared down the stairs. My body was shaking, adrenaline surging through me, but at least he was gone, or so I thought. Less than a minute later, the intercom buzzed again. I nearly dropped my phone. I switched to the feed for the building entrance, and there he was, standing outside looking up at my window. He wasn't holding the box anymore. His hands were in his pockets, and his expression was blank. Then he did something that sent chills down my spine. He pulled something out of his pocket, a small, folded piece of paper, and pressed it against the glass of the intercom. Even from the grainy camera feed, I could see my name written on it in jagged, uneven letters. I froze, staring at the screen. My name on that piece of paper felt like a warning, a deliberate way to let me know this wasn't random. My hands shook as I tried to think of what to do. Should I confront him through the intercom? Ignore him? Call the police? Before I could decide, he pressed the paper harder against the glass, almost like he wanted to make sure I could see it clearly. Then he slowly slid it down, revealing something underneath, a crude drawing of what looked like the layout of my apartment. My stomach turned as I realized it wasn't just any layout. It was mine, drawn with unsettling accuracy. The placement of my couch, my TV, even Pepper's scratching post, it was all there. Panic set in. How did he know my apartment's layout? He couldn't have seen all of that just from standing in the hallway. My mind raced, replaying every moment of his brief time at my door. Was he watching me before tonight? Had he been inside my apartment before? The thought made my skin crawl. Suddenly, the intercom buzzed again, loud and grating, breaking me out of my thoughts. He wasn't speaking or pressing the button in bursts. It was a constant, steady buzz, like he was holding it down just to unnerve me. Pepper darted under the couch again, her tail puffed up, and I couldn't blame her. I felt trapped, like prey in my own home. I forced myself to snap out of it and grab my phone to call the police. My fingers fumbled as I tried to dial, but before I could press call, the buzzing stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse. I switched back to the camera feed, expecting to see him still standing there, but he was gone. My relief was short-lived. A new sound broke through the quiet, scraping coming from the fire escape outside my bedroom window. My stomach sank as I realized he must have moved around the building. I crept toward the bedroom, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I reached the window and peeked through the curtain. There he was, climbing the fire escape with deliberate, unhurried movements, like he had all the time in the world. He wasn't looking at the window, which somehow made it even worse. He was focused on the steps, one hand gripping the railing, the other clutching something I couldn't quite make out. I backed away from the window, trying to keep my breathing quiet, but my mind was screaming at me to do something. I grabbed a heavy lamp from my bedside table, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I didn't know what my plan was. Break the window? Scare him off? Whatever it was, I knew I had seconds to decide. I couldn't just wait for him to reach the window. My hands trembled as I unlocked it and pushed it open a crack. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice shaking but loud enough to cut through the night air. He froze mid-step and slowly turned his head toward me. His face was illuminated by the dim light from a nearby street lamp, and what I saw made my blood run cold. His expression was empty, completely devoid of emotion, except for a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, like he was suppressing a smile. He didn't say a word, just stared at me, unblinking. I held the lamp high, ready to swing if he came any closer. "I've called the cops," I blurted, hoping it would scare him off. For a moment he didn't move. Then, as if deciding something, he turned and started climbing back down the fire escape. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. He stopped halfway down and looked up at me again. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand to show me what he'd been holding, a small key. My stomach dropped as I realized it looked exactly like the one for my apartment door. He tilted his head, almost playfully, and then pocketed the key before disappearing into the alley below. I slammed the window shut and locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I called the police immediately, barely able to get the words out as I tried to explain what had just happened. They said they'd send someone out, but I could already tell by their tone that they didn't fully grasp how serious this felt. When the police arrived about 20 minutes later, I was still clutching the lamp, my back pressed against the door like it was the only thing keeping me safe. 2 officers came up to my apartment and I told them everything, about the delivery, the empty box, the knocking, and the fire escape. They checked the building, including the alley and the fire escape, but found no sign of the man. They asked if I recognized him, but I didn't. I showed them the camera footage, but it was grainy, and the angles didn't capture enough detail to identify him clearly. One of the officers tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a disturbed individual looking to scare someone. That didn't make me feel better. Before they left, they recommended I change my locks and call them if anything else happened. That night I barely slept. Every little creak and groan of the building set my nerves on edge. The next morning, I called a locksmith first thing and had every lock in my apartment replaced, including the fire escape window. For weeks, I lived on edge, jumping at shadows and second-guessing every knock on my door. I never saw the man again, but sometimes, late at night, I think I hear faint footsteps in the hallway or a light scrape at the window. It's probably just my imagination, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there watching, waiting. And the scariest part? I never found out how he got that key. Story 5. The House That Watches. I'm not the type to get paranoid easily. I work in IT, so I know my way around tech, and I've always been the one my friends call when their Wi-Fi isn't working or their computer won't turn on. Back in 2020, my wife, Lisa, and I decided to upgrade our home with smart devices. Cameras, lights, even a fridge that could tell us when we were running low on milk. We thought it was the ultimate convenience. At the time, our daughter Emily was 2, and the idea of controlling everything from my phone felt like a game changer, especially for a busy family. Everything ran smoothly for a year or so. Then one night last fall, things started getting weird. It was around 11:30 p.m. Lisa and Emily were asleep, and I was on the couch, scrolling through Reddit when the lights in the kitchen flickered. Not just a brief blink like during a power surge, they flickered rhythmically, almost like Morse code. I chuckled to myself, figuring it was a bug in the system. I grabbed my phone to check the app, but as soon as I opened it, the lights went off completely. My heart skipped a beat when I noticed the app said the lights were still on. That's when I heard a faint click from the baby monitor upstairs. I froze. The house was pitch black. My breathing was the only sound, shallow and uneven. I fumbled for my phone, using the flashlight feature to guide me back to the kitchen. The app was still open, and the living room feed was frozen on an image of me standing there, flashlight in hand. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the screen. This wasn't just someone messing with the lights or hacking into our cameras. It felt personal. I turned off the app and called Lisa's name, my voice cracking slightly. No response. Panic bubbled in my chest as I rushed upstairs to check on her and Emily. I burst into our bedroom, half expecting to find someone there, but it was just Lisa, still asleep. I shook her awake, trying to explain what was happening, but I could barely string the words together. She squinted at me, groggy and confused, muttering something about having a bad dream. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a motion alert. It was a notification I'd never seen before. Unknown device added to your network. My blood ran cold. I showed Lisa the screen, and now she was wide awake. "Who added it?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. I opened the app again, my fingers trembling, and checked the list of connected devices. Among our usual ones, phones, laptops, the baby monitor, there was something labeled Observer_01. My stomach dropped. It had connected just minutes earlier, around the same time the lights went haywire. "Lisa, pack a bag," I said, trying to sound calm, but my voice betrayed me. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but when I showed her the screen, she didn't argue. She grabbed Emily while I went back downstairs to grab the car keys. That's when I heard it, a soft creak coming from the back door. I froze, my ears straining to hear over the pounding of my heartbeat. The creak came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of the doorknob turning. I held my breath, praying it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy wooden cutting board, and edged toward the door. It was open, just a crack, letting in a sliver of cold night air. I swung it open the rest of the way, my flashlight cutting through the darkness outside. There was no one there. But then I noticed something on the ground just outside the door. A small black object, no bigger than a deck of cards. Camera. I picked up the camera, my hand trembling. It was sleek and unmarked, the kind of device you'd see in spy movies, and it definitely wasn't ours. My mind raced. How long had it been there? Who put it there? And why? I felt a wave of nausea as I realized the camera had been pointed directly at the door, as if waiting for someone to open it. I stuffed it into my pocket and locked the door, my hands fumbling with the latch. When I turned around, Lisa was standing at the top of the stairs, Emily cradled in her arms, her face pale. "What's going on?" she asked. I didn't know how to answer without scaring her more. "We need to go," I said, trying to sound firm. "Now." But before we could move, the lights came back on. Not all at once, but one by one, starting in the living room and moving toward us like someone was flipping the switches manually. My phone buzzed again, another notification. Front door camera. Motion detected. We didn't have a camera at the front door either. My breath hitched as I opened the app and tapped on the notification. The screen loaded slowly, each second stretching into an eternity, until the feed finally appeared. It showed a man standing on our porch, wearing a hood that obscured his face. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring directly into the camera. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. The man didn't flinch, didn't blink, like he knew we were watching him. Lisa gasped behind me, and I turned to see her clutching Emily tighter, her face etched with fear. "Who is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I muttered, though the truth was I didn't want to know. I turned off the app and yanked open a drawer, grabbing the largest kitchen knife we had. "Stay upstairs," I told Lisa, my voice shaking but firm. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded and hurried back up, her footsteps barely making a sound on the carpeted stairs. I made my way to the front door, my pulse hammering in my ears. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing. No man, no shadow, just the empty porch bathed in the faint glow of the street lamp. My grip on the knife tightened as I opened the door, stepping outside cautiously. The air was cold and the street was eerily silent. There was no sign of anyone, but I noticed something on the porch where the man had been standing. A piece of paper, folded neatly, weighted down with a small stone. I picked it up with trembling hands and unfolded it. Scrawled in messy, jagged handwriting were 3 words: "We are inside." My knees nearly buckled as I read the note. I stumbled back into the house, slamming the door shut and locking it, twisting the bolt until my fingers ached. My mind was racing, every worst-case scenario flashing through my head. I checked the locks on every window, every door, while clutching the knife like it was my last line of defense. Upstairs, Lisa whispered, "What's happening?" from the landing, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But the truth was, I was terrified. If they were already inside, what chance did we have? I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers fumbling over the screen. The operator's calm voice was like a lifeline in the chaos. "We're dispatching officers to your location," she said after I explained everything. "Stay on the line." I nodded even though she couldn't see me, pacing the living room while trying to keep an eye on every corner. Then, as if to mock me, the app sent another notification. "Nursery camera. Motion detected." My blood ran cold. I bolted upstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time, and burst into Emily's room. Lisa was there, holding Emily, who had started crying. The camera on the wall was moving again, scanning the room in slow, deliberate arcs. "Turn it off," Lisa screamed, clutching Emily tightly. I didn't need to be told twice. I ripped the camera off the wall, the plastic cracking in my hands as I yanked the wires free. The room fell silent except for Emily's muffled sobs and Lisa's shallow breathing. I held the broken camera in my hand, staring at it like it was some kind of cursed object. It didn't matter though. Whoever had been watching us clearly wasn't doing it through just one device. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Every single smart device in our house was a potential window for them to see through. The lights, the fridge, even the thermostat, everything was compromised. The sound of sirens in the distance snapped me out of my thoughts. Relief surged through me as I realized the police were finally on their way. "We need to get outside," I said, grabbing Lisa by the arm. She nodded, her face pale but determined, and we headed downstairs. Just as we reached the front door, the lights in the house flickered one last time. But this time they didn't come back on. The house plunged into complete darkness. My phone buzzed again, and despite every fiber of my being telling me not to, I looked at the screen. A final message flashed on the app. Goodbye. We stumbled outside into the cold night air just as the squad cars pulled up. The flashing red and blue lights lit up the street, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I could breathe again. 2 officers approached us, their expressions a mix of concern and confusion as I tried to explain what had happened. I handed them the camera I'd ripped off the nursery wall and showed them the note I'd found on the porch. One of them radioed for a tech specialist while the other swept the house, but deep down I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whoever had done this wasn't just some random hacker. They were playing a game and we were the pawns. The police stayed for hours, but eventually they left, assuring us they'd investigate. We packed a few essentials and stayed at a hotel that night. I didn't sleep a second. Every sound, every shadow in the room made my skin crawl. Over the next few weeks, I replaced every smart device in the house with dumb versions. No cameras, no internet connections, no fancy features. We even moved Emily's crib into our room for a while. It's been months now and nothing strange has happened since, but I still can't shake the feeling that they're out there watching, waiting. I'll never forget the last thing the officer said as he handed me back the note. Whoever did this, they weren't just watching. They wanted you to know.